The transport shuttle sliced through the upper atmosphere of Thrice, a frozen moon that orbited the gas giant Orion 6, where the sun was little more than a pale blue dot on the horizon. From the cockpit window, the cadets saw a world of white plains, ridged glaciers, and jagged ice cliffs that caught the faint light like shards of glass. Inside the cabin, the air was tense with anticipation. The cadets of the Galactic Survival Academy, species from across the Orion Arm, had been briefed on the mission: endure 24 hours on Thrice with standard-issue equipment. It sounded simple on paper, but even the instructors had admitted that the moon's weather was unpredictable, and its winds had ended more than one survival exercise in disaster. Evan Cole, the only human in the class, sat near the back of the shuttle, fastening the straps of his thermal gear while listening to the aliens chatter nervously in their native tongues. His breath fogged the visor of his helmet. Across from him sat a towering Yikaresh student whose exoskeleton shimmered in shades of violet under the cabin lights. She was whispering something about the last time her species had attempted training on this moon. Half the cadets had to be evacuated when a whiteout rolled in faster than predicted. Evan said nothing. He adjusted his gloves and stared at the glacial surface growing larger beneath them. The landscape looked calm from above, like powdered marble. But he knew the quiet of ice could hide a storm waiting to strike. When the shuttle landed, the airlock opened with a hiss, releasing a wave of bitter cold. The first step outside was always the hardest. The shock of Thrice's atmosphere bit straight through the thermal suit, numbing every exposed nerve. Evan stepped onto the crusted snow and squinted into the glare. The air tasted metallic, and the horizon shimmered with the faint dance of auroras. Around him, the cadets fanned out, unloading gear crates and unfolding glimmering plasma tents. The instructors stood apart, wrapped in thick black armor with orange visors. One of them raised her multi-limbed arm and announced in a sharp, synthesized tone, "Your challenge begins now. You have 3 hours to establish base camp. At nightfall, temperatures will drop to lethal levels. No external assistance will be provided." The Yikaresh instructor's voice echoed across the frozen valley, swallowed by the wind. The alien cadets hurried to follow orders. They activated heating fields, scanned for stable terrain, and deployed atmospheric stabilizers. The snow glittered in the light of their plasma tools, casting a surreal glow over the field. Evan moved slower, kneeling to scoop up a handful of snow. He rubbed it between his gloves, noting how fine and dry it felt, almost like dust. That kind of texture meant the temperature was dropping fast. The moisture had frozen out of the air completely. It reminded him of stories his grandfather had told him back on Earth about Arctic explorers who learned to read snow like language. Powdered snow meant brittle wind. When the wind turned brittle, the storm wasn't far behind. Evan walked to the edge of the plain where the valley curved upward into a low ridge. He took a deep breath and watched the faint vapor drift sideways, torn by invisible gusts. The direction of the drift told him the wind was shifting, pulling from the northwest. In the far distance, the horizon looked darker, almost bruised, as though something vast and heavy were pressing toward them. He clicked on his communicator. "Storm front coming in from Quadrant 7. He said calmly. "We should reinforce the tents on the leeward side." A reptilian cadet nearby turned his yellow eyes toward him. "The meteorological scanner shows nothing," the alien replied. "Your human eyes must be deceiving you." He laughed, a harsh sound that misted the air. Evan shrugged, unwilling to argue. He had learned that sometimes the instruments of the galaxy's brightest minds failed to notice what the instincts of a death-world species could feel in its bones. Over the next hour, the camp took shape. Transparent domes pulsed with soft light, glowing against the gathering twilight. The cadets moved with mechanical precision, following protocols memorized from their manuals. Evan helped secure one of the tent anchors, his hands already stiff from the cold. He noticed that the air pressure was dropping faster than expected. A low hum vibrated through the ground beneath his boots, wind tunneling through distant ravines. When he looked up, He saw the first flakes spiraling down, slow at first, then faster, swirling like silver dust in the pale air. By the time the second hour passed, the horizon had vanished. The sky and ground became one colorless void. The wind's tone deepened, building from a whisper to a roar. The alien cadets laughed at first, finding thrill in the challenge, but the laughter faded as the temperature sensors began flashing warnings. Evan crouched beside one of the plasma domes, inspecting its structure. The membrane quivered violently under the growing gusts. The heat field flickered, struggling to maintain cohesion. He pressed his hand against the side, thin as silk. It rippled under his palm. "It won't hold," he muttered to himself. "Not in this wind." The Yikaresh instructor paced among the domes, her voice distorted by static. "Cadets, increase plasma stability to maximum. Maintain formation and await further instructions." But even as she spoke, a violent gust slammed into the nearest dome. The membrane ripped with a sharp crack, scattering shards of light like shattered glass. A scream followed, then chaos. The storm had arrived. Snow exploded across the camp, blinding and relentless. The wind tore at everything: gear, cables, tents, even the aliens themselves. Evan hit the ground, crawling against the gale. He grabbed the arm of a smaller cadet who had fallen, dragging him toward a half-collapsed shelter. The noise was unbearable, a constant shriek of air and ice that drowned every sound. Visibility dropped to nothing. Evan's mind went quiet in the way it always did in crisis. His heartbeat slowed, his focus sharpened. He pressed his back against a mound of snow and realized it was holding firm against the wind. The thought came to him suddenly, instinctively. Snow isn't the enemy. It's the wall. He shouted into the communicator, "Dig! Use the snow itself as shelter. The deeper you go, the warmer it gets." But most of the others couldn't hear him. The signal was breaking apart in the interference. He started digging with his gloved hands, clawing into the snowbank, shaping a narrow trench. The first layer was hard as stone, but beneath it, the snow turned soft and compact. He tunneled in until the wind's scream dulled to a distant howl. Inside that shallow hollow, the air felt eerily still. He pressed his palm to the wall. Already, his body heat was beginning to reflect back at him. For a moment, he sat there, catching his breath, the silence pressing close. He thought of Earth's polar explorers, of the old black-and-white photographs showing men wrapped in furs beside snow shelters, faces frostbitten but alive. He remembered reading about how snow could trap warmth, how a well-built trench could save a life when technology failed. On Thrice, surrounded by species that thought survival came from science alone, he felt the ghost of his ancestors beside him. Evan poked his head out of the trench and saw nothing but white chaos. The storm had swallowed the entire camp. Plasma domes were gone, torn apart and scattered into glowing fragments that faded into the snow. He could barely make out shapes moving in the blizzard, cadets stumbling, shouting, waving frantically. The instructors had vanished into their armored shelter, sealing themselves away. Evan clenched his fists, anger rising. "You cowards," he whispered. "You call this a lesson?" The wind howled louder, shaking the ridge above him. He ducked back into the trench and kept digging, widening it until there was room for 2, maybe 3 cadets. He knew that by dawn, half of them would be gone unless someone acted. As he worked, his breath came in slow clouds, and a strange calm settled over him. The white silence of Thrice was no longer terrifying. It was simply alive, a voice of nature testing who deserved to remain. By the time the storm reached its full fury, Evan had already built the foundation of what would save them all. A hollow in the snow, no more than shoulder deep, but strong enough to defy the wind. While the aliens screamed into their communicators for help, he closed his eyes and listened to the sound of the storm pounding above like a heartbeat. He knew it would not last forever, and when it ended, he would still be here, because he had learned that survival was not about resisting nature, but understanding her language. On Thrice, the storm spoke in violence, and he answered with patience. When he finally leaned back, his body aching. The trench glowed faintly blue from the filtered light above. The air was quiet, almost gentle. He smiled behind his frost-covered visor. The others might still believe technology was salvation, but tonight he would prove that the oldest tools, the mind, the hands, and the will to adapt, were still humanity's greatest weapons against the void. The blizzard on Thrice showed no mercy. The sky had disappeared into a swirling veil of white, and the ground, which once reflected faint light from the horizon, was now a shapeless void of moving frost. Evan Cole's trench trembled under the constant pounding of the wind, but it held. The snow, packed tight by his own hands, had turned to a solid shell. He sat pressed against the wall, listening to the muffled roar outside, waiting for a break in the storm. The cold crept in waves, biting through layers of insulation. His hands burned with numbness, and his heartbeat pulsed heavily in his fingertips. Yet his mind stayed sharp. The human instinct for pattern, always searching, calculating, was working inside him like a second heartbeat. He needed to know how many cadets were still out there. He tapped the side of his helmet, switching his communicator to wideband mode. Static filled his ears. A few scattered voices broke through, panicked, fragmented messages carried by the storm. Dome 3, collapsed, no visibility. Another voice followed. Instructor shelter sealed, coordinates lost. The rest was just white noise. He clenched his jaw. The instructors were supposed to monitor and guide them, but it was clear the Yikaresh officers had abandoned their students, leaving them to prove their worth alone. For most of the alien cadets, that meant dying in the snow. For Evan, it meant acting before the others froze where they stood. He crawled to the entrance of the trench and brushed away the packed snow sealing it. The moment his head rose above the edge, the wind hit like a physical force. Icy particles stung his visor, cutting visibility to almost nothing. His breath fogged the glass instantly. Through the howling air, faint light glimmers flickered. Plasma shards from destroyed tents, or the remaining heat shields still trying to function. The landscape looked like a war zone. Pieces of equipment tumbled across the ground, rolling like ghosts. Evan squinted and saw movement, a figure stumbling, collapsing, then trying to crawl again. Without hesitation, he dragged himself out of the trench and pushed against the wind. Each step forward felt like walking through wet concrete. The wind shoved him sideways, nearly toppling him into the snow. He gritted his teeth and leaned into it, using his arms to shield his helmet. When he reached the fallen figure, he dropped to his knees and turned the body over. The cadet's eyes were dull, face covered with frost. It was a Thalorian, one of the amphibious species whose skin turned brittle in dry cold. The cadet was still alive but barely conscious. Evan slapped his communicator, switching to emergency signal mode. "I've got one down," he shouted into the storm, unsure if anyone would hear. "I'm bringing him in." He wrapped his arms under the cadet's shoulders and dragged him through the snow, retracing his path toward the trench. The resistance was brutal. Each meter felt like hauling a stone through a current. His muscles burned and his vision blurred, but the thought of leaving someone behind felt worse than the pain. When he finally reached the trench, he rolled the cadet inside and covered the entrance again, sealing them both from the wind. Inside, the silence returned, broken only by the sound of 2 labored breaths. Evan removed his glove and pressed his fingers against the alien's neck. The pulse was weak, but it was there. He grabbed one of the emergency heat pads from his suit pocket and activated it, pressing it against the cadet's chest. The Thalorian stirred, blinking slowly. His voice was faint and slurred. "Why? Help. Me?" Evan gave a small smile, even though the other couldn't see it through his visor. "Because if you die, the Academy fails, and I'm not planning to freeze out here alone," he said simply. It was easier to keep the tone light. The cadet let out a sound halfway between a cough and a laugh, then closed his eyes again. Evan checked his vitals once more, ensuring the heat pad was doing its job. He leaned back, staring at the snow ceiling that dimly glowed with refracted light from outside. The storm had now become a living thing, roaring, breathing, testing. After several minutes, he decided he couldn't wait for it to end. Others were still out there, and if he didn't act, more would die before morning. He took a small scanner from his belt, adjusted its settings to read body heat through the snow, and held it to the wall. The device flickered uncertainly, but picked up faint traces, several moving shapes not far from his position. They were close, maybe 50 meters to the east, clustered near what had been the command tent. He knew the plasma core inside that tent would draw survivors looking for heat, but it would also attract the worst of the wind. The structures there would not last much longer. Evan took one more look at the Thalorian, then unsealed the trench again. "Stay here," he said, even though the alien couldn't respond. The wind swallowed him the moment he climbed out. The storm was louder now, the kind of sound that made the air vibrate in his lungs. He crouched low, moving in bursts from one patch of packed snow to another, scanning for shapes. Then, through the veil of ice, he saw 3 figures huddled together behind a half-buried crate. He recognized one of them, an insectoid cadet from Vular Prime who had laughed at his warning earlier. The cadet's wings were frozen solid against her back, and her limbs moved sluggishly. She spotted him and raised a trembling hand. Evan reached them and dropped to his knees. The group was in terrible shape. One cadet's breathing was shallow, the other's visor cracked and leaking heat. "You have to move!" he shouted over the wind. "Come with me! There's shelter!" The Vular female tried to stand, but her joints locked. He grabbed her arm, forcing her upright, then motioned for the others to follow. One stumbled forward, but the third didn't move. Evan knelt and checked his pulse. Nothing. He exhaled sharply, fighting down the frustration rising in his chest. There was no time to mourn. He turned back to the 2 survivors and began guiding them toward the ridge. The journey back felt endless. The storm seemed angrier now, as if resenting his defiance. Every step was met with resistance. One cadet collapsed halfway, screaming that she couldn't go on. Evan didn't hesitate. He lifted her onto his shoulder, grunting under the weight, and kept moving. The trench was near. He could sense it in the faint shift of wind patterns around the ridge. When he finally reached the spot, he dropped to his knees and began digging frantically through the snow cover. The entrance emerged like a shadow in the white. He pushed the 2 aliens inside first, then followed, sealing it shut again with blocks of snow. Inside, the air was warmer now, thick with the combined heat of 4 bodies. The Thalorian stirred at the sound of movement, blinking as the others crawled in beside him. Evan quickly assessed the situation. One cadet had mild frostbite on her arms. The other was in early hypothermia. He distributed the remaining heat pads, then pulled a small thermal blanket from his survival pack. "Press close," he said firmly. "Body heat transfer. No gaps. You'll live if you keep still." The Vular female's compound eyes glimmered faintly as she looked at him. "Humans are insane," she whispered, voice trembling. "You dig holes in the snow to live?" Evan smirked. "Only on Mondays." A few weak laughs followed, but the fear still lingered in their faces. Evan noticed that their confidence, the same arrogance that had filled the shuttle earlier, had vanished. They were no longer elite cadets from a dozen advanced civilizations. They were frightened beings clinging to life. He felt a strange mix of pity and pride. This was the truth that the Academy never taught. Survival didn't bow to rank or technology. It favored those who adapted first. The hours passed slowly. The storm raged on above them, but the trench stayed strong. Frost formed in delicate veins along the ceiling, glowing faintly in the dim light of their suit lamps. Evan checked his wrist display. It was just past midnight. Outside, the temperature must have dropped below negative 100 degrees Celsius. He wondered if any of the instructors were even watching, or if this entire exercise had gone beyond their control. He wouldn't be surprised if the Yikaresh officers had retreated to orbit and sealed themselves away in warmth and safety. He looked at his exhausted companions and felt the weight of responsibility settle deeper in his chest. He hadn't come to Thrice to play the hero. He had come to prove that humans deserved their place in the Galactic Academy, even if every other species saw them as primitive. Yet here, in the heart of the storm, that proof didn't need words. It lived in the rhythm of his breath and the heartbeat of those who now depended on him. Somewhere above, the wind began to shift. The deep howling softened slightly, and the vibrations against the walls eased. Evan listened carefully, tilting his head. The storm wasn't ending, but it was changing direction. The pressure drop meant the eye was moving east. That gave him an idea. If he could connect this trench to a secondary shelter behind the ridge, he could create an airflow buffer and stabilize the temperature. It would be hard work, but waiting idly would kill them. He grabbed his multi-tool and started carving into the snow wall. The others stared in disbelief. "You're expanding it?" the Vular female asked weakly. "It's warm now. Why risk?" "Because it won't be warm for long," he interrupted. "The snow packs tighter under pressure. It'll suffocate us if the tunnel closes. We need a second exit." He continued digging, the rhythmic scrape of metal against snow filling the silence. The motion kept his blood flowing, his thoughts clear. When exhaustion threatened to drag him down, he imagined the look on the instructors' faces when they found their helpless human not just alive, but leading the survivors. By the time he finished carving the new passage, his arms trembled with fatigue. He slumped against the wall, breathing hard. The others were watching him silently now, their eyes full of something different: respect. Evan didn't need to say anything. He simply nodded once and closed his eyes for a brief moment of rest. Above them, the storm howled on, tearing through what remained of the camp. The tents were gone, the domes shattered, the proud emblems of alien technology erased by the raw will of nature. But under the snow, a handful of cadets, kept alive by a human's ancient instinct, waited out the blizzard in silence, unaware that the night was far from over. The storm finally began to lose its voice. It did not stop. It simply grew tired. The screaming wind above the snow softened into a low, distant moan that pulsed like a living creature exhaling its last breath. Evan Cole lifted his head and listened carefully. The sound had changed in pitch and rhythm, becoming uneven. That meant the pressure front was weakening. He rubbed his hands together, trying to summon warmth into his stiff fingers, then looked at the exhausted faces around him. The cadets, 2 aliens from Vular and the Thalorian who had barely survived, lay half asleep under the silver blanket, their bodies pressed together for warmth. The air in the trench was heavy with condensation, each breath forming a faint mist that drifted toward the low ceiling. Evan exhaled slowly, the fog of his breath glowing faintly in the dim blue of the snow walls. He checked the temperature gauge on his wrist. Negative 92 degrees outside, rising to just below freezing inside the trench. That tiny difference meant everything. He had turned this frozen tomb into a fragile pocket of life. For the first time since the storm hit, he allowed himself a short moment of satisfaction. But it didn't last. The Thalorian stirred, groaning softly, and Evan immediately crouched beside him. The alien's skin, translucent and patterned with dull gray veins, looked brittle. He pressed his fingers against the creature's wrist, still a pulse, slow but steady. He placed a new heat pad on his chest and adjusted the pressure so the warmth would spread evenly. The Vular female, her compound eyes now faintly luminous, shifted beside him. "How long until it ends?" she asked in a voice roughened by exhaustion. Evan shook his head. "Hard to tell. Could be hours. Maybe more." She stared at the snow ceiling. "I've never been so helpless," she said softly. "All our equipment, all our training, it's useless here." Evan gave a short laugh that lacked humor. "Welcome to Earth logic. We learned early that nature doesn't care about plans. Only results." She turned her gaze toward him, studying his face through the thin frost on his visor. "You sound calm. Do you not feel fear?" He hesitated for a moment, searching for the right words. Of course I do, he admitted. But fear doesn't help. It's just noise. You listen to it, and you stop thinking. You stop surviving. He looked at her intently. So you quiet it. You make it small. Then you move. The Vular female nodded slowly, her breathing evening out. Something in his tone settled her nerves more than his words. Evan glanced at his wrist monitor again. The signal beacon he had activated earlier was still blinking weakly. It should have transmitted their coordinates to the instructors, but no rescue signal came back. He began to suspect what he had feared from the start, that this test had gone far beyond what the Academy planned. Maybe the instructors were trapped themselves, or maybe the exercise was meant to push them this far. Either way, waiting for help was no longer an option. He looked around the cramped trench. If the temperature outside rose slightly after the storm, the snow structure could soften and collapse. They needed to reinforce it. He removed his gloves briefly, feeling the sting of the cold bite into his fingertips, and began scraping along the side wall with his tool, carving small shelves. He placed the empty food containers there, pressing them against the snow so they would freeze in place, creating a lattice that distributed weight. The others watched, confused. "What are you doing?" the male Vular cadet asked. "Strengthening it," Evan said. "The walls are holding for now, but when the outer layer starts melting and refreezing, it'll crack. This will absorb the stress." He worked steadily, his breath rhythmic, every movement controlled. His focus had become mechanical, a trance of survival. After several minutes, the Vular male joined him, using his clawed fingers to dig grooves where Evan pointed. The work gave them purpose, and purpose was the best cure for fear. Together they reinforced the trench from end to end, packing snow between makeshift braces. The repetitive sound of scraping and breathing filled the small space, creating an odd sense of peace amid the chaos outside. The Vular female sat with the Thalorian, gently rubbing his hands to keep the circulation going. Evan noticed how she moved, delicate but determined. Despite her exhaustion, she had refused to give in to panic. When they finished, Evan slumped against the wall, wiping the condensation from his visor. The effort had raised the temperature in the trench by another degree. He could feel warmth returning to his fingers and toes, though the ache lingered. "Good work," he said quietly. "You're learning faster than most cadets do in a classroom." The Vular male gave a short, humorless chuckle. "In class, we debate theory. Out here, we debate whether we'll wake up." Evan smirked faintly. "That's the real exam." For a while, no one spoke. The silence felt almost sacred. The storm's muffled rhythm was hypnotic, like the pulse of the planet itself. Then the Thalorian stirred again, muttering in a voice barely audible. "The heat. It feels strange." Evan leaned closer. "That's good," he said gently. "It means your body is waking up." The alien blinked slowly, focusing on him. "You are not like the others," he said weakly. "You move as if this world belongs to you." Evan paused, unsure how to respond. "No," he said finally. "It belongs to itself. I just listen to it." He reached for his pack and pulled out a small ration bar. The wrapper was half frozen, but he tore it open and broke the bar into pieces. "Eat," he said, passing it to the others. "It'll help your body keep the heat." The Vular female hesitated, then accepted it. The Thalorian tried to take a bite but struggled to chew. Evan reached for his canteen, melted a bit of snow against his chest armor, and poured a few drops into the alien's mouth to help him swallow. Watching the human's patience, the Vular male finally asked, "Why do you know all this? No human could have trained for these conditions in this part of the galaxy." Evan smiled faintly. "You forget where I come from. Earth isn't kind. We learned to survive in deserts, jungles, oceans, and frozen hells like this one long before we learned to fly. We didn't evolve for strength or claws or venom. We evolved for endurance, for adaptation." His voice lowered as he stared into the dim blue of the snow. When something tries to kill us, we learn how to make it teach us instead." The others looked at him in quiet awe. The storm outside cracked, the sound echoing through the walls like distant thunder. The pressure changed again, sending a thin trickle of snow down from the ceiling. Evan stood immediately, brushing it away before it spread. The walls had started to settle under the new temperature gradient. He knew that meant the worst part was almost over, but it also meant the structure could shift unpredictably. "We need to dig an escape route," he said quickly. "If the snow above starts to collapse, we'll be trapped." The Vular male frowned. "In this wind, we'll be buried alive." Evan shook his head. "Not if we dig toward the ridge. The snow's denser there. It'll hold better. We only need a small opening for air." He picked up his tool again and began carving upward at an angle. The snow resisted at first, but soon loosened. The others joined in, passing chunks of ice behind them. As the passage grew, a faint glow began to filter through, a thin, cold light, almost gray. Evan stopped and pressed his palm against the surface. He felt air movement. "We're close," he whispered. With one final shove, the wall gave way, revealing a narrow slit that opened into the frozen world beyond. He widened it just enough for ventilation, then sat back, breathing heavily. The light spilling in painted the trench in pale silver. The storm had weakened to a restless wind, carrying fine snow like dust. The silence that followed was profound. For the first time in hours, they could hear their own breathing clearly. The Vular female let out a shaky sigh of relief, leaning her head back against the wall. "It's beautiful," she murmured. Evan followed her gaze through the small opening. The landscape outside was no longer hostile. It shimmered like glass under the faint dawn light. He allowed himself a long breath, feeling the fatigue settle deep into his muscles. He could rest now, but not for long. There was still food to ration, plans to make, and other cadets who might still be alive somewhere beyond the ridge. Yet for this brief moment, he felt something he hadn't since the shuttle first landed, a strange calm that bordered on gratitude. The storm had tried to erase them, but in doing so, it had stripped away everything unnecessary. What was left was pure instinct, endurance, and a shared will to live. Evan looked at his companions, now huddled close but no longer trembling in fear. The trench glowed softly around them, a hollow of warmth in an endless wasteland. He realized that this place, carved from ice and desperation, had become more than shelter. It was proof. Proof that humanity's strength was not in muscle or machinery, but in the quiet persistence that refused to die. Outside, the wind shifted again, gentler now, whispering through the snow slit like a sigh. Evan listened to it and smiled faintly. The storm had spoken its language of fury, and he had answered with his own: patience, craft, and the stubborn will to survive. The pale light filtering through the narrow vent slowly dimmed again as the sun slipped beneath Thrice's horizon, leaving the world outside to the mercy of the endless cold. Evan Cole knew that meant another cycle of darkness and dropping temperatures. The brief calm between storms had been only a pause, a breath of the frozen planet before it drew its strength again. He sat upright inside the trench, his back pressed to the curved snow wall, listening to the faint hum of wind above. It had changed once more, no longer the shriek of violence, but the slow, grinding whisper of air moving through the ice. That sound worried him more than the storm itself. It meant the snow had started to shift, compacting under its own weight. The trench might not last until dawn. He looked around at the others. The Thalorian still slept, though his breathing was steady now. The two Vular cadets were awake, huddled together, conserving body heat and whispering in their native language. The faint bioluminescence of their eyes cast small reflections on the snow. Evan had grown used to the rhythm of their breathing, the small gestures of exhaustion, the quiet gratitude they tried to hide. But he also saw fear returning, not the paralyzing kind from before, but a deep, gnawing unease that came from realizing they were far from rescue. He decided not to tell them what he suspected about the instructors. It would serve no purpose now. He stretched his stiff legs and checked the beacon again. The blinking signal was fading. The battery, designed to last 48 hours, had been weakened by the extreme cold. If it died, the instructors would never locate them, if the instructors were even still alive. He sighed quietly and rubbed the ice from his visor. He needed a plan. Survival was no longer just about enduring the cold. It was about preparing for the next storm and finding a way off this cursed plane. The Vueler male broke the silence. "The snow is moving," he said, his voice trembling slightly. Evan nodded. "Yes, it's settling. We need to reinforce the ceiling again before it collapses." The alien looked uncertain. "Can we even dig anymore? My arms feel like they're made of stone." Evan forced a faint smile. "Then move slower, not harder." He grabbed his multi-tool and began carving small notches into the wall to add support beams using frozen slabs from the passage. The others reluctantly joined in, scraping and pressing the blocks into place. Each motion was a fight against exhaustion. The air grew heavier, filled with steam from their breaths. As they worked, the sound of the wind changed again. Evan froze, his hand pressed to the wall. It wasn't just air movement. There was a faint vibration, like a low rumble traveling through the ground. He frowned. "Do you hear that?" The Vueler female stopped, listening carefully. "It's deep," she said, eyes wide. "Like something beneath us." Evan nodded slowly. "Subsurface ice cracking. The temperature drop is causing expansion. If the ridge above fractures, this whole section could slide." The thought made his stomach twist. If an icequake hit, their trench would become their grave. He took a breath and steadied his voice. "We have to move higher. There's a hollow on the ridge where the snowpack is thicker. It might hold." The Vueler male stared at him in disbelief. "Move now? In this dark? We'll freeze out there." Evan met his gaze. "We'll freeze faster if this trench collapses." He stood, pulling the scarf tighter around his neck. "Pack what you can carry. Leave the rest. We move together." The aliens exchanged a look, then nodded weakly. Evan moved to the vent and widened it carefully with his tool. A rush of freezing air flooded in, biting his exposed skin through the suit. The outside was dark again, not total blackness, but a faint silver dusk that shimmered across the snowfields. He climbed out first, squinting against the wind. It wasn't as strong as before, but the cold was vicious, sharp enough to feel like a blade against his face. The temperature display on his wrist had already dropped below -100. He helped the others out one by one, supporting the Thalorian, whose steps were unsteady but improving. The alien's eyes reflected the faint starlight, dull but alert. Once everyone was out, Evan pointed toward the ridge, barely visible in the dim light. "There," he said. "It's only a few hundred meters." It sounded close, but in the heavy snow and thin air, every meter felt like 10. The group began to move, trudging through knee-deep drifts. The silence of the world around them was almost unnatural. No animal cries, no shifting ice, nothing but the soft crunch of boots. Evan led the way, stopping often to check the wind direction and terrain. The moonlight reflected off the snow so brightly that shadows vanished, leaving the world flat and depthless. Once, the Thalorian stumbled and fell, gasping as the cold pierced through his suit. Evan immediately crouched and helped him up, his voice firm but calm. "Don't stop moving," he said. "The cold wants you still. Don't let it win." Halfway up the ridge, the rumbling sound returned, louder this time. The ground shuddered, a slow, rolling vibration that traveled through Evan's boots and up his legs. "Move!" he shouted, pushing the others forward. The slope cracked behind them, opening a jagged fissure that released a puff of frozen mist. A section of the lower plane collapsed, swallowing what remained of their trench. The group reached the upper shelf just as the ground below split apart. The vibration faded, replaced by the eerie quiet that followed destruction. They stood in silence, staring down at the void where their shelter had been. The Vular female trembled. "It's gone," she whispered. Evan nodded grimly. "Then we're lucky we moved when we did." He scanned the area ahead. The ridge stretched into a shallow plateau, slightly elevated and shielded from the direct wind. The snow here was dense, layered like sediment, perfect for a stronger shelter. "This is it," he said. "We'll dig here." He began shaping the snow again, carving with deliberate strokes. The others joined him without hesitation now, following his movements instinctively. The Thalorian, still weak, sat at the edge and gathered smaller chunks of snow to pass forward. Hours blurred as they worked. Sweat froze inside their suits, muscles screamed, but the rhythm of digging became almost meditative. When the first tunnel was complete, Evan widened it into a circular chamber with smooth walls. He reinforced the entrance with angled slabs, leaving only a small crawl space for air. Inside, the sound of the wind faded to a muffled hum again. When the shelter was finally complete, Evan collapsed onto the snow floor, breathing hard. His arms ached, and his fingers felt swollen inside his gloves. But the chamber was sturdy. He could feel it in the way the air temperature stabilized, in the way the walls no longer trembled with each gust outside. The others crawled in after him, collapsing beside one another. The Vular female laughed softly, a sound that bordered on disbelief. "We should be dead," she murmured. Evan smiled faintly. "Not today." The warmth returned slowly, seeping from their bodies into the enclosed space until the air felt breathable again. Evan removed his helmet briefly to wipe his sweat, letting the cold sting his skin. It felt alive, like proof that he was still human. He looked at his companions, the once proud cadets who had arrived on this planet certain of their superiority, now reduced to silent survivors who watched him with a mixture of respect and awe. He didn't feel pride, only exhaustion. The Thalorian stirred, his voice still weak but clear. "When the Academy hears of this, you'll be honored." Evan shook his head. "Honor doesn't mean much to the dead. We survive first. Then we talk." He leaned back against the wall, listening to the faint wind above. The ridge creaked softly, the ice shifting like an old ship's hull. Every sound was a reminder of how fragile their safety still was. He thought of Earth for the first time in days, of the smell of pine after a winter storm, of the way frost covered the windows of his childhood home. He remembered his father's voice teaching him how to read snowdrifts to find windbreaks. "The snow listens," his father had said once. "If you respect it, it tells you where to live and where to die." Now those words echoed in his head, more vividly than ever. He smiled faintly. The snow had spoken again tonight, and he had listened. As the others drifted into uneasy sleep, Evan remained awake, sitting near the entrance and watching the faint light filter through the thin ice. Outside, Thrice slept too, vast and indifferent. He could feel its power all around him, cold, ancient, endless. Yet, in the middle of that frozen silence, a small flame of warmth existed, fragile but real, carved by human hands. He had taught the aliens how to live through the storm, but what he hadn't realized was that the storm was also teaching him about endurance, leadership, and the quiet dignity of survival. Hours later, as the wind began to rise again, Evan's eyes grew heavy. He rested his head against the snow wall and let the faint hum lull him toward sleep. The planet outside prepared another trial, and the ridge groaned under the shifting weight of ice. But for now, inside the small chamber of light and breath, life persisted. The night that tested them all had not yet finished, but Evan Cole no longer feared what was coming. He had already seen the worst Thrice could offer, and learned to build warmth out of its fury. When the first light of morning touched the ridge, it came not as a sunrise, but as a faint silver glow spreading through the snow walls. The storm had finally passed. Evan Cole stirred from a shallow, dreamless sleep, feeling the stiffness of his muscles and the ache deep in his spine. His breath condensed in the cold air, and for a brief moment he didn't remember where he was. Then the faint sound of breathing around him reminded him. The others were still alive. He raised his head and saw the Vular female curled against the wall, her translucent eyelids flickering with signs of life. The Thalorian was awake too, sitting up slowly, his gray skin damp with melted frost. The Vular male had already crawled to the entrance, peering at the soft light filtering through. Evan pushed himself up, every joint protesting, and reached for his gloves. The silence outside was unnatural after so many hours of roaring wind. It felt too quiet, too still, as if the world had frozen mid-breath. He crawled toward the narrow entrance and brushed away the thin crust of snow that had formed overnight. A blinding wave of pale light spilled in, forcing him to squint. The landscape beyond took his breath away. The endless plain of Thrice, once a chaos of white storms and shifting shadows, now stretched calm and pristine under the soft reflection of Orion 6's distant light. The sky was a pale gray with streaks of ice clouds curling over the horizon, and the air shimmered faintly, full of frozen dust. The ridge on which they had built their new shelter stood like an island above the buried ruins of the old camp. Evan could see fragments of metal and shattered equipment poking through the snow far below. The once glowing plasma tents were gone, consumed by the storm. Only smooth, wind-carved mounds remained where the proud cadet domes had stood. For a moment, he simply watched the stillness, feeling the weight of what they had endured. The storm had erased everything: pride, arrogance, technology, leaving behind only the raw truth of survival. He climbed out carefully, his boots sinking slightly into the new layer of powder. The cold bit at his exposed skin, but it was no longer unbearable. The air was clean, sharp, almost sacred. He turned back toward the shelter. "It's clear," he said. "We made it." The others began crawling out one by one, shielding their eyes from the sudden brightness. The Vular female stopped beside him, staring at the horizon in awe. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Her voice trembled not from cold but from emotion. Evan nodded slowly. "Sometimes beauty hides behind destruction," he said quietly. They stood together in silence for a long time, letting the sunless light wash over them. Then duty returned to Evan's mind. He checked his wrist beacon again. The battery light blinked weakly, but still pulsed. If the storm had ended across the region, the instructors might finally pick up their signal. Yet part of him didn't want to rely on that hope. The planet had taught him not to wait for help that might never come. He needed to make sure they could survive another day if necessary. He looked at the Vular male. "We need to check for supplies. The ridge might have trapped some equipment under the snow." The cadet nodded and began scanning the slope below. Evan followed, using his multi-tool to probe through the crusted drifts. Within minutes, he hit something hard, a fragment of metal casing. He dug it out, revealing a half-buried storage pod. Its latch was frozen solid, but after several strikes with the tool, it cracked open. Inside were emergency rations, a flare gun, and a small portable heater. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "We're not done yet," he murmured with a faint smile. The heater came to life after some coaxing, its faint red glow spreading warmth into the cold air. The others gathered around it, their faces reflecting the fragile light. The Thalorian held his hands near it, his webbed fingers trembling. "I thought I would never feel warmth again," he said softly. Evan handed him a ration pack. "You'll feel plenty more if we keep moving smart." He opened one for himself and took a slow bite, savoring the dull, dry taste of synthetic protein. It was the best thing he had ever eaten. As they ate, a faint hum began to build in the distance, low and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of the sky. Evan looked up sharply. The sound grew louder, spreading across the plain. Then a shadow swept over them, long, oval, metallic. A rescue shuttle. The Galactic Academy insignia gleamed faintly on its side. The Vular female gasped, her eyes wide. "They found us!" Evan didn't move at first. He simply watched the craft descend, its thrusters melting streaks into the snow. The hum of its engines filled the air with vibration, shaking loose flakes from the ridge. When the ramp extended, two armored figures stepped out. Y'Karesh instructors, their exoskeletons shining with frost. One raised a scanning device, sweeping it across the ridge. "Survivors detected," the synthetic voice announced through the helmet speakers. The second approached the group, stopping a few meters away. "Identify yourselves." Evan stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Cadet Evan Cole, Human Division, Galactic Survival Academy. These three are alive because we adapted. The rest—" He didn't finish. The instructor studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Your performance has been noted. Extraction will commence immediately." The tone was flat, almost indifferent. No praise, no sympathy, just procedure. Yet Evan saw something else behind the mirrored visor. A pause, a subtle stiffness, as if the officer wasn't sure how to process what he was seeing. A human, the weakest species in their academy, standing alive while most of the others had perished. The silence that followed felt heavier than the storm had. The cadets boarded the shuttle in silence. As the ramp closed, Evan took one last look through the viewport. The landscape of Thrice stretched beneath them, a field of endless white, marked only by the faint outline of the ridge where he had built his final shelter. He thought of the first trench, the panic, the endless digging, the moments when he thought the cold would finally claim him. And yet, here he was. The planet had taken everything but had given him something greater: clarity. As the shuttle lifted off, the light grew brighter, reflecting off the endless plains like glass. The Vular female leaned closer to the window, whispering, "I never imagined this world could look peaceful." Evan smiled faintly. "It's peaceful because it already won. It doesn't need to fight us." She looked at him, confused, but he didn't elaborate. He simply leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes as the warmth of the shuttle filled the cabin. Hours later, the craft docked with the orbital station that hovered above Thrice. The cadets were greeted by medics and debrief officers. Evan sat quietly while scanners ran over his body, checking for frostbite, dehydration, and stress fractures. The medics murmured in disbelief at the readings. Mild hypothermia, slight malnutrition, nothing life-threatening. He had endured the planet's wrath and walked out almost untouched. When the official report was delivered to the Academy Command, it caused an uproar. The instructors had lost more than half their cadets during the storm. Only 4 had survived without external aid, led by a single human. Rumors spread through the training halls, whispers of the Death Worlder who taught the others to live. Some dismissed it as luck, others as exaggeration. But those who had shared the trench with him knew the truth. The Academy's archives would later describe the event as the Thrice survival incident, an unexpected display of adaptive intelligence by human cadet Evan Cole. Evan didn't care about the titles or the reports. In the days that followed, he spent his recovery time near the observation deck, watching the frozen moon spin below the station. From this height, Thrice looked calm and small, a glittering marble of white and blue. It was hard to believe that down there, beneath those clouds, he had carved life out of death with his own hands. He thought of the trench glowing faintly in the dark, of the heat radiating from their joined bodies, of the silence that had turned into peace. Those memories stayed with him more vividly than any metal could. When the time came for reassignment, the Academy commander summoned him personally. The towering insectoid regarded him through multifaceted eyes. "You showed initiative and resourcefulness," she said, "but you also disobeyed standard evacuation protocol. Why?" Evan met her gaze without hesitation. "Because the standard failed," he replied. "Rules can't save you when the planet decides otherwise." The commander's mandibles twitched, the alien equivalent of a smile. "Perhaps," she said. "Or perhaps you simply reminded us why your species survived its own death world." She dismissed him with a nod, and he walked out into the station's quiet corridor. Beyond the window, Orion 6 burned faintly against the dark. Evan paused, resting his hand on the glass. The reflection staring back at him was pale, exhausted, but alive. The others passed behind him, the Vular female, the Thalorian, the surviving male, talking softly about returning home. He turned to them and gave a small nod. No grand speeches, no promises, just understanding. They had shared something that words couldn't define. As he walked away, the distant light from Thrice flickered in the viewport, like a dying ember refusing to go out. Evan smiled faintly. The storm had tried to erase him, to prove that even the strongest technology meant nothing against the will of nature. Instead, it had proved the opposite, that even in the face of annihilation, the smallest flame could endure. The human flame. And in that endless silence of space, he carried it forward, knowing that on a frozen moon where no fire should have survived, one had, and it had burned warm enough to remind the galaxy what humanity truly was.